Assalamu alaikum and welcome to Community Platform. We are in the heart of Blackburn, waiting for 4th of July, when elections will take place. And of course we have independent people who are standing for Blackburn with Darwin. We also have the Labour Party's main contributor. But the point of this conversation is very much, why would you have so many independents standing up in highly Muslim populated areas, not only just in Blackburn? We are delighted today to have Craig Murray, who's standing as an independent, and of course our very own Brother Jahangir. I welcome you both. Thank you for coming and giving us your time. And of course we are in the campaign offices, Craig Murray's campaign offices. So you might hear some clutter, but that's obviously because the work is going on. Craig, I welcome you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for finding time. I was reading about you, and my goodness, I can't read the whole paper because there's 3 or 4 papers here, but if I can just say that you are a broadcaster, human rights activist, you're also the British ambassador to Uzbekistan, faraway place, very faraway place. And you were the rector at the University of Dundee. You graduated from University of Dundee, and of course you were also the, I think, the president of the Dundee University Students' Union. So a lot of experience, a lot of background. And Mohammed Jahangir, you don't need any introduction because you're an old participant from on Ummah TV channel. But of course you now are the director and the founder of Iron Institute, which didn't exist at that time. Yeah, how's that going?
It's going really well. We've set up in 2020. We produced a lot of reports. We're doing a lot of work and a lot of strategic thinking, including, on the Muslim community, elections and independence and
2 important words, elections and independence.
Yeah,
but let me ask you a question, Craig. What makes someone like yourself come all the way from Scotland, of all places, to Blackburn?
Well,
I mean, it never stops raining here, you know that.
And I've noticed. In fact, I feel that that famous image of Rishi Sunak outside Downing Street, he got off lightly. He could have been in Blackburn. It would have been worse.
True.
I came here in 2005 because then I resigned from the Foreign Office over torture and extraordinary rendition, which was happening in Uzbekistan where I was ambassador. And I discovered that the British government knew about torture and extraordinary rendition and was complicit in it. And I couldn't do that. I couldn't sleep if I were going along with something like that. So I came here to Blackburn in order to stand against Jack Straw. And I think it's important to be open and say that if Jack Straw had been the MP for Brighton, I would have stood in Brighton. If he'd been the MP for Edinburgh, I would have stayed in Edinburgh. But he was in Blackburn. So I came here because I wanted to tell people that 2 things. Firstly, that the UK was complicit in sending Muslims from around the world to be tortured in Uzbekistan and killed. The Council of Europe report says that half the flights that went to the famous extraordinary rendition site in Poland went on to Uzbekistan afterwards. They brought in hundreds of people, and not one of them has ever been seen again. Unlike the ones from Poland, some of whom survive and go around telling the tale. Nobody who was renditioned to Uzbekistan has ever been seen again. They're all dead and buried in the Kizilkum desert. So I came to tell people that. And also, I knew, because among the many jobs I'd had in the Foreign Office, at one stage I was the head of the Foreign Office section of the Embargo Surveillance Center, which monitored Iraqi arms procurement. So I knew for certain that we knew Iraq didn't have weapons of mass destruction. It was just a complete lie, a fabrication. And Straw and Blair were lying when they said Iraq had WMD. It wasn't a mistake or an accident or misperception. So I came to tell people that in Blackburn in 2005. And I was rather, I can think of no other way to put it. I was shocked when the Muslim population of Blackburn said, we don't care. We really don't care. We don't care how many Iraqis, Jack's daughters killed. We want to get planning permission for
Did
our
that
mosque.
surprise you?
Yeah, I was astonished. Genuinely, I was astonished by the corruption of the leadership of the mosques in Blackburn and how they were much more interested in government grants or planning permissions than they were in a million dead Iraqis. And even as I say it, it seems to me a surprising statement, but it is true.
I think from my point of view, and many Muslims, we've seen how the Labour Party control the Muslim vote. I've used the phrase that they own the Muslim vote. And one of the objectives of myself in this election is to break that control. But, we have a phenomenon called Labour mosques. So the Labour Party's invested in control of Muslim communities for a long time. And they use their networks, as you say, they use small grants to mosques and community centres, which keeps people happy, but it also keeps them under control. But what also happens is the Muslim community fails to develop as an independent community with its own strategic goals and, in some cases, its own policies. Even, when there's a protest on a burning issue, the party usually comes, or party representatives usually try to control or put people off from even protesting, whether there's a school issue or not. So it's been a long-standing problem, so it shouldn't surprise us, really. I know for Craig it would be a shock, but it's interesting that you've returned, Craig. Why would you return to a community, some might ask, or certain sections who stabbed you in the back before, and you've come back to this place?
Well, I guess I thought I'd give them a second chance. That's why I came back. And
some would say that you never learned.
I think you could say that about my entire life. I spend a lot of my life hammering away against various injustices, and the sheer viciousness of power. A state is the monopoly of violence. That's what a state is. They have the right to control people, lock them up, execute them in some cases. A state is the monopoly of violence, and a state is controlled by hard men. And if you spend your life campaigning against injustice, you have to have the ability never to learn, because you get hit on the head continually while you're attempting to right injustice, and you have to just keep going and going and going and chipping away at the marble, waiting for it to crack. But it fascinates. One very interesting thing is the genocide in Gaza has caused a reaction against Labour in the Muslim community, which the killing of in Iraq they killed 1 million people. So far they've only killed. That sounds terrible. I don't mean it that way. But in Gaza they've killed 10% of the people they killed in Iraq, and yet in Iraq the Muslim community didn't revolt against the Labour Party. Was now over Gaza they are, and it's to do with immediacy. I think it's to do with the fact that the poor people in Mosul and Fallujah didn't have mobile phones, couldn't live stream the destruction of their children, whereas in Gaza they can. And I think now Muslim communities have actually seen on their mobile phones what is happening to the people of Gaza. That's why the reaction is different to it was when the same thing happened.
So technology wasn't there at the time. That's what you're basically saying.
Exactly. It wasn't.
You couldn't see it. I think there was a revolt even at that time, maybe not in Blackburn, but in other areas, and the Respect Party won some seats. But as a consequence of that, you had the mayoral election. So there was an attempt. Yeah. But I think what happened was on 7/7, that changed the framework, and Muslims were sort of, certain Muslim groups went into government, joined the agenda for Prevent, and as a result of that integrated them back into the Labour Party and
But
the
now there is
desire for grants. I think there's a genuine desire now and understanding that the Muslim community needs to break away from the political mainstream political parties. Blackburn, in a way, will be a test to see how far that process has happened. So I think that it is different.
But do you think that this resentment, if I may use that word, coming against the Labour Party is coming from the elders of the Muslim community, or is it the younger generation who can see things from a different perspective? Because when I look around and see the leadership, political leadership and religious leadership, I see no change.
Yeah, I think the leadership, the elders obviously have a loyalty to Labour, and some of them still think that the Labour Party is the party of the workers, as we saw the Imam the other day from here telling people to vote Labour because we're Mazdoor workers, and it's a part. I mean, I don't know which planet they live on, but the Labour Party is not the party of the workers. It's a party of the elite and the big business now. So
yeah, but wasn't there
the younger people, I think, have changed.
Yeah, but wasn't there a time? I mean, I'm telling my age here. We were told that the mosques do not get involved in politics. The leadership, the religious leaders, do not get involved. They wouldn't make comments. I remember asking for a comment from a very senior academic and a religious leader, and it was no-go area. And you took that as granted. And here you're telling me that the imams are now asking.
That's never been the case. The only politics they don't allow is the one that comes from an independent perspective or a Muslim perspective. They've always allowed Labour Party into mosques, and many have remained neutral, but sometimes, I've seen them before a Friday sermon, given 15 minutes, 20 minutes. So I think this notion that the mosques are not involved in politics, we know that Council of Mosques and others, they have councillors. There's a total conflict of interest.
So I'm so sorry, but I'm a Muslim. That's dishonesty. I'm sorry, that is absolute black and white dishonesty on the parts of the religious leadership.
Well, I think there's conflicts of interest, I would say, and they're not always
I think there's
sincere.
I think one thing that is happening as a result of Gaza is there is something of a split between, as you say, it's partly part of the fault line is between younger and older.
Yes.
But it's not just that, because there are, I've had in my campaign, I've had plenty of very, very aged Muslim heads of family come to see me and say they'll support me. But this notion that there is a community leadership, and then everyone does what the community leadership says, I'm happy to say, because I think it's a very good thing, that is breaking down. And I had a guy from 5 Pillars come to interview me. And partly during the interview, and I think in part of the interview it wasn't actually broadcast, but also talking privately, not for broadcast, he was saying to me, why don't you leave? Why don't you give in? Why don't you stand down? Because you have no support in the Muslim community here. I said, what on earth are you talking about? I said, go walk down the street, talk to the first 20 people you see, one by one, with no one else listening, and ask them who they're supporting. And if you find I have no support, well, I'll give up. I'm not. I don't think he embraced exactly the same methodology that I suggested, but he did go out and talk to a lot of people, and he discovered actually I had quite a lot of support. But he had been talking to the community leaders, all of whom had told him, no, we're not supporting Craig Murray. And I think that notion that those people who they may be imams, they may be councillors, they may be heads of political party, or they may occupy positions in the Labour Party or whatever. The idea that they tell everyone how to vote and then everyone votes en bloc the way they're told, which happened, and that was a very real thing in Blackburn 20 years ago. I don't think it works anymore. I'm not saying that it doesn't work at all, but that is very substantially fractured. And happily, Muslims are at least as intelligent as the rest of the population, and as capable of thinking for themselves as the rest of the population. And by and large, they are. by and large,
No,
they are.
I think that's a very important point, that the younger generation is thinking, is educated, politically educated. No, they're not politically illiterate, but you still have pockets where you would put women into your cars and say, this is where you're going to put your eggs. Yeah. That has not eradicated, that has not gone, that still exists.
I think it's changing. I think we saw in Rochdale that's changed. I know from Rochdale that the younger or the middle-aged Muslims went to their elders and mosques and said, no, this is how we're doing it. And it was a difficult thing for a lot of them because they've been voting Labour all their life. It's the only thing they know as an addiction. But I think that has changed. But we shouldn't, I work in my private business with lots of mosques and charities. And the one thing that mosques always tell me is we don't represent the wider community because the religious element is only a small element. A lot of the Muslim community are not of the Islamic activist type scene, so they are more secular. They'll support PTI or other parties, so they're not like that. It's always been a myth that they represent the entire community. There are different communities in different towns. There isn't a single Muslim community as much as some people would like to see that. It doesn't exist.
I mean, Blackburn was once labelled as the most divisive community, a very divisive community, and I just want to come back to that. Is Blackburn a divisive community? Not between the Asians and the non-Asians, but I'm here talking about within the Asian community. You have a very high percentage of Indian Muslims here. You have a very high percentage of Pakistani Muslims here. Is there a difference of opinion between these two communities? Who they are supporting? Why are they supporting? Now, I know that a young man who's standing as independent has very high percentage of Indian community leadership backing him up. And I'm asking the question, what's going on here? That's never happened before. It hasn't. So what's going on here? Is that to create a split vote? Is that to bring back the Labour Party? What's going on?
Well, I don't know the dynamics in Blackburn, but obviously there are two big communities, the Pakistani community and the Indian community, and you're more aware of the dynamics.
I just live outside of it. I just want to make sure that is known.
But yeah, I mean, there are different communities, and some have more influence, some have less influence.
Sure.
And that happens in other towns and places as well.
It's also, it's quite interesting here to see within the Asian community, as you say, there are different communities that operate with community events and functions and relationships, and which don't appear to intermarry very much. Particularly, you've got Pakistani, Gujarati, and then you've got within those, you've got Kashmiri, for example, and that's interesting. But I will say also, I mean, I'm still concerned about the segregation between Asians and non-Asians in Blackburn, because it's not natural. I just don't know anywhere else where you have wards which are 100% Asian and wards which are 100% white. That's virtually. I use white for lack of a better word. Please don't be offended. But and you have schools like that, and you have. But this is deliberately created by the council, because over the years you've had social housing which has been segregated in effect, and that can't happen without council connivance. And schools which are segregated, which can't happen without council connivance.
Well, it's a history. I mean, I've worked in councils, and certainly in the northwest, in Oldham, in Rochdale, and when I was working in those places, I came to Blackburn. It's been a deliberate policy of councils, because of discrimination, not to rehouse Asian communities in council housing or in other areas because of the fear of a backlash, but also the cost. So when I worked in places like Rochdale, in Oldham, in Blackburn, the emphasis was on redoing the properties rather than demolishing and creating new properties. And that's what you see as a legacy of that, the sort of failure to invest large amounts in Asian communities because they would be seen as favouring a particular community, not making the right decision. So that's happened a lot across the Northwest. So you have Muslim communities, Asian communities who are concentrated in certain areas. So it's not really as a matter of choice. But I agree that, and now it's difficult because if you sell your terraced house, you're not going to be able to buy a house in another area elsewhere.
Tell you what worries me, if you go into the town centre, it's got slightly better in the last 20 years ago. It struck me because it was absolute. It was 100%. Now it's a tiny bit better. But if you go into the town centre and just watch ordinary people walking around, you don't see mixed groups of people. You don't see some Asian lads and some white lads walking together in the street or playing football together, or just a mixed group. You see very few mixed marriages, but very, very few. But it's that lack of socialising. How do people get to understand each other? They don't talk to each other. It's very, and that's very, very different to a larger city where you will see mixed groups of people all the time, just interacting without any thought as to what race or religion any of them are, just interacting normally, socially. And to an outsider like me, and I'm an outsider in Blackburn, it's just peculiar, the lack of mixing, simply the lack of social mixing. I found it very
Craig, you just reminded me of an incident, and I'm really saddened to think that we haven't really moved on. Talking about just after 7/7, and I was asked to join Blackburn Cathedral. And one of the first things that we did, that my colleague who is a Christian, Chris, we decided that the one thing what we're going to do in this place, which has been marked as the most segregated place on the planet, to walk in town centre in certain areas. And it was absolutely amazing how many times we were stopped. Because, with his dog collar and my headscarf, we must have looked a really odd couple. And we were labelled as an odd couple. And people will ask, where'd you come from? Who are you? What are you doing here? And I'm really saddened to think that is still apparent.
But isn't that a failure of the local council, but also the local councillors? Because local issues really are for local councillors and the local leadership here to get their heads around that. So what have the councillors been doing to address those issues?
See, my theory is, I think, that the Labour Party has deliberately kept the Asian community separate in every possible way as a safe and secure vote bank. But it's been in their interest to keep, not to integrate. It's been. I don't think this situation has developed entirely accidentally. I think it's been encouraged by all kinds of policies. But it is interesting. I hope we'll see it break down a bit more. Certainly, one thing that's been great fun we've done during this election campaign. We've had 4 or 5 public meetings so far to which anyone can come, and the audience has been very much mixed at all of them, and that's rather nice. And I hope that happens in other spheres. But if you just go into the library and see different groups happening, and I did this the other day, and those groups might be they might be mothers groups or an interest group or whatever. Again, the groups tend to be Asian or white. Even groups which are subject-based don't, by and large, look mixed. And I just find this all extraordinarily strange. As somebody who's lived my life in situations where essentially you're blind to race and religion. You just, people are people, and you do whatever you do with anybody. I do find the degree of segregation in Blackburn extraordinary and unhealthy.
But isn't it easier to control people, if I use those word control, when they are in separate containers? Isn't that much easier?
I think that's what it's about, and to manipulate people. And there's a lot of an awful lot of misperception. I mean, we've had several people on my own campaign team say to me, I should say, Asian people on my own campaign team say to me, well, don't talk, let's not talk about Gaza in the white areas because they're not interested in Gaza. And it's not true. It's not true. Not true at all. And you get those misperceptions. When I stood for Parliament here before in 2005, I lived on, I think, Dundee Street for 3 months, just off Audley Range. And the people at Audley Range used to warn me against going to Mill Hill on the grounds that, I'd get attacked. Don't go there, you'll get attacked and beaten up. And when I went to Mill Hill, people were so lovely to me and kept inviting me in for cups of tea and chatting with me. And they kept saying to me, stay away from Audley Range.
Why would they attack you? For goodness sake, you're white, for God's sake. Why would they attack you?
I think they thought my anti-Iraq war message wouldn't go down well. But
for me, Craig, this election really is about Palestine.
Very much.
The next 5 years, I think, are probably the most significant period for the Palestinian struggle. And really, leaving local issues aside, I think the Muslim community, and I've said this, should be considering that as the key issue. And we need to have a presence in Parliament and outside, where people who can best advocate and articulate the case for Palestine are present. And for the same reason we supported the campaign for independence, and then obviously the Workers' Party emerged, because given the scale of what's happened since October the 7th, we simply couldn't have an election where the party sort of consensus and the media consensus was the only issue to be discussed on Palestine. We needed that at the doorstep, not just in Muslim communities, but in non-Muslim communities. We needed to take that. So my question to you really is...
Can we save that question? Because we're now going to go for a very short break. And now don't lose that question.
Okay.
We'll be back with you in a short while. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to Community Platform. As you probably can hear, there's a very active office of Craig. And of course, we are back with a question that we couldn't ask. Jahangir bhai, shoot.
So, this, for me, the Muslim community should see this as a Palestine election. Vote Palestine, vote against Israel. So I'm encouraging people to vote for the strongest advocate for Palestine at this election. So really what I want to hear from you, Craig, is if you are elected, would you be the best advocate? And what would you do for Palestine, given the next 5 years are going to be an incredibly important struggle for the Palestinian people, something that will take place in the Muslim world, but also here And what can we do here? And what would you do?
Yeah, I agree with you, but this is an absolutely crucial time. And it's a time when we're on the cusp of great change, because either Israel's going to complete its genocide, particularly in Gaza, then move on to the West Bank, move on to southern Lebanon, or Israel itself is going to be ended. In the same way that apartheid South Africa was ended, from having lost international legitimacy and support. And I think we're very near that point now. The world opinion has changed on Israel irrevocably, I think. With the possible exception of Germany, where Holocaust guilt plays a major distorting role in public perception. Everywhere else in the world, public opinion has swung strongly in favour of the Palestinians. Public opinion swung strongly in favour of Palestinians. Even in the United States. And I never thought I would live to see the day when public opinion in the United States favours the Palestinians over Israel. Because of the strength of the Israeli lobby and the fact that politicians are basically bought, it takes time for that public opinion to feed through into international action, but it will do. And one of the ways it's feeding through into international action is through the international legal mechanisms. Now, I was involved in devising the strategy. In fact, I devised the strategy for taking Israel to the International Court of Justice. I wrote a couple of papers on it, a couple of articles on it, which I published in October and November. Andrew Feinstein, who's standing against Keir Starmer, was instrumental in getting those to the South African government, specifically initially to the South African Foreign Minister. They were then given to the whole South African cabinet, and that was what started the work. And that was only less than 0.1% perhaps of the work. In the same way that a match, which lights a fire, is less than 0.1% of the fire, but without the match, the fire would never have started. I in no sense claim credit for what South Africa did, which I think was fantastic, but I was directly instrumental in kicking off the use of the Genocide Convention against Israel, and I was there in the court for that. And I went on to speak at the Human Rights Committee in Geneva in December. So my Palestinian activism, yes, I've addressed 400,000 people in Hyde Park in 2009 during that stage of the genocide. It's always important to remember, I think, this is a 76-year genocide. This is not a genocide that started in October. But I do the marching up and down and speaking to meetings, addressing demonstrations. I do that side, but I also do practical work. Because without the ICJ taking a hand, there would be no question of an arrest warrant at the ICC. Once the ICJ finds there is a genocide, which is 2 or 3 years ago, I don't see how they can avoid finding here, domestically, in domestic law here, complicity in genocide by continuing to give arms to Israel during the genocide. So that set in course a train of events which we'll work through. I know they take time. The next plan we have is to get the United Nations General Assembly to suspend Israel in the same way we suspended South Africa. And that can be done in such a way. There's a very good lawyer, Francis Boyle, who has written articles on the subject. That can be done in such a way that the Security Council cannot veto it. They cannot veto the suspension of a state by the General Assembly. And so that's what I want to work on next. Now, I'm doing all this anyway, and I've achieved quite a lot as a private citizen, but think how much more I can achieve if I'm a member of Parliament, how that helps open doors.
Yeah, but Craig, the match that existed with South Africa, or matches that existed, you had Madiba, you had Bishop Tutu. We don't have any of those characters for Palestine. And worst, the Holocaust became a guilt trip for most countries. So we seems to be stuck in that corner.
I think that's gone. I think the whole anti-Semitism scam, for example, has now died. You know, they yell anti-Semite at people all the time. But it no longer has the force it did. I had a phone call from the Sun newspaper about a week ago saying that the campaign against anti-Semitism has produced a 14-page booklet on me saying I'm an anti-Semite and did I want to comment. I said, no, thank you, I don't want to comment because I just can't be bothered. Because they spout this utter nonsense about opposition to genocide makes you an anti-Semite. And if that had happened to me 10 years ago, I'd have been terrified. I'm being called an anti-Semite. Nowadays, people realise that it's a trick. And it's a trick to suppress the truth. And most people realise it. Most people of all races and creeds and everywhere in the world realise it now. But I think the exploitation
there is, of course, some anti-Semitism.
Well, of course it exists. Yeah. But I'm certainly fortunately in this country, very little. I've lived in Poland and Russia and places where there's a lot of genuine actual anti-Semitism across the entire population, and people say things sometimes that make your hair stand up. Anti-Semitism does still exist. It's a historic thing which has existed particularly in European Christian populations for centuries, and like any racism, it's appalling. But there's no race that doesn't suffer racism. You know, I'm a Scot. There are plenty of people who say good things about the Scots.
Yeah. Absolutely. So, but in terms of, obviously we've got two very pro-Israel, pro-Zionist parties. The Labour Party is going to be in power. I mean, what can we do to tackle that, or what will you do to? I mean, obviously, if you're elected, you'd be a voice, but how will that feed through in your work if you were elected?
Yeah. Well, I would be a voice. I'd be a voice in. You know, there are very few voices for Palestine in the House of Commons. There are very few. There's George Galloway, there's Jeremy Corbyn, and Jeremy himself, because he suffered so greatly by his effort to reform the UK fundamentally into a more socially just country was destroyed by the Zionists using the anti-Semitism smear. So Jeremy is now a rather subdued voice for Palestine. There's Jeremy Corbyn. There's George Galloway. There's not much more.
But Craig, whilst I think it's so important that everybody must speak up for justice, and that's really important. What makes you think that you're going to make a difference when you think about Jeremy Corbyn, who was absolutely demolished at a certain time because he was labelled as anti-Semitic?
Yeah, I think Jeremy, I'm very fond of Jeremy, and I think he was far too apologetic and gave ground and kept apologising for things, but instead of saying that's nonsense, I'm not an anti-Semite, I'm an anti-racist, have been my whole life. And this guy, the majority of people expelled from the Labour Party for anti-Semitism have been Jewish. I think that's all you need to know about how ridiculous this is. Instead of defending people, Jeremy kept thinking, if I feed him to the wolves and him to the wolves and him to the wolves, that will appease them. And of course, that was never going to happen. And I can promise you, I won't back down or attempt to appease anybody who makes false claims. But you need some, essentially, in this election, you've got the choice of adding another nodding Labour Party backbench MP who's just going to support the fanatical Zionist Keir Starmer. If Labour get into power, which looks almost certain they will, all the great offices of state will be held by members of Labour Friends of Israel. All the top leadership who are going to occupy the main ministries are members of Labour Friends of Israel, and they're all paid by the Zionist lobby. Every single one of them's taken money from the Zionist lobby, including during the genocide. So do you want someone who's going to sit behind them and vote for them, or do you want someone who's going to stand there and call them out and say, inside Parliament itself, the first thing I will do as an MP is to stand up and name all the MPs who have accepted Israeli lobby money during the genocide. That will be the first contribution I make.
You're a very dangerous man, Craig.
Would you?
I hope so. Do my best.
Would you call for the Friends of Israel to be listed as a foreign-backed entity, or they're not the only one. Obviously, we have Saudi-backed foreign lobbies and other Middle Eastern-backed lobbies. Emirates, for example, they all try to put pressure. I mean, it seems to me that there's especially when matters related to Israel or Saudi Arabia, these people shouldn't be voting, should they? There's a conflict of interest. We have charity and business laws where conflicts of interest have to be declared, and you have to not be. It seems like Parliament's the only place where people can have all kinds of interests, and they're still involved in decision making.
Yeah, I think. I mean, obviously, at the moment, because of the genocide, the Israeli lobby is very much in the spotlight, and we realise how much money we give. How they control politics through cash, basically, and that's simply true. But they're not the only ones. There are things like the private healthcare lobby. I think we need to, and I think 60 Labour MPs receive money from firms who profit from the privatisation of services within the NHS, for example. I think, as a member of Parliament, you get a very good salary, and you get government money to employ your research staff and secretarial staff. I don't think you should be allowed to accept money from other places at all. You don't need it. It's simply a way of buying you, and it's extraordinary that as a candidate here now, I have to be very careful when people donate to my election campaign to make sure the money's not coming from abroad, because if it's coming from abroad, that's illegal. And yet you've got David Lammy receiving £70,000 from the Zionist lobby after the genocide has started. So there's some tremendous double standards here between the establishment and everybody else. But I think it should be illegal for MPs to accept money from lobbies. Full stop.
Yeah, it is not morally illegal, but it is illegal. As a banker, you're not even allowed to accept even a piece of handkerchief. It's not acceptable because you can compromise.
Yeah, of course.
And we don't accept it from Russia or China,
No.
because they're seen as people interfering in our democracy and our affairs, but we're quite happy to accept that interference from other places.
Yeah, no, that's very true.
Yeah.
So, that's among the things that I would seek to call out as a member of Parliament. But I'd also use that platform. I'm very interested. I say once the ICJ decides on the main case, which is 2 or 3 years away, they will decide that this is a genocide. Then we have to push for the legal system here to activate against those who've been complicit in the genocide. And there again, I'll use my platform as an MP to push for that to happen. I'll be doing it anyway as a private individual, but as an MP, simply you have much more standing. It'll be much harder. They'll still do it to some extent. It'll be much harder for the media to justify never allowing me on mainstream media if I'm an MP. Even George Galloway actually does get onto mainstream media because he's a member of Parliament. It definitely gives you a platform that you don't have just as an individual. And at the moment, Blackburn has a member of Parliament who has all those advantages and never uses them. I mean, has anybody, I've nothing against the lady, but has anybody ever seen her on television? Has anybody ever seen her make a speech? She doesn't do anything useful at all with the platform. Give me that platform and I will use it.
So we need to elect people around the country who are able to be the strongest advocates for Palestine, but also have the sort of ability and experience to be able to use those platforms.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. You need to have a certain, particularly if you're not from one of the major parties. I mean, if you're from one of the major parties, one of the things I think is wrong with politics today is that most MPs, or a great many MPs, don't have any background other than politics. They don't know anything about anything. They get into the party at university, then they become a research assistant, a special advisor, then an MP, and they've done nothing but machine politics their entire lives.
No lived experience.
No lived experience. And I think it's very important to, especially if you're an independent or from a very small party like the Workers' Party, it's very important that you come in ready. You come in prepared with a background, a hinterland of knowledge and experience, and a knowledge of how to work the system. And I think that is what I bring.
Yeah, a lot of theory, not enough practice. Any last words before I conclude?
Well, I think maybe we should discuss what the role of the Muslim community should be in this great struggle.
I don't think you've got enough time for that.
Okay.
Maybe we can. No, I'm not going to say it.
Any last questions from you?
But as a Muslim, and a very staunch Muslim who's lived in this country for a long time, never had any problems, right? So I find it very, very strange that we need to get somebody from Scotland to come here to tell us what to do, right? Right. But yet we needed that. We needed that.
I've heard this local argument all the time, that local people, I've worked in local government in different areas, and sometimes people from outside can unite you. And there's no greater example than our Prophet Mohammed. He was from
Mecca, went to Medina.
Medina, they've been fighting for hundreds of years. Who brought peace and who took them to a different vision. So it's not necessarily the case that local, and he never married somebody from the Ansar as well. You're not advocating something here, are you? I'm not advocating something. I'm just saying that that's for the local people. I've made my position clear on many forums that we should choose the strongest advocate for Palestine.
Yes.
Because this is what it's about. But in terms of local, people who are local also tend to be influenced by local people and the local power brokers. So they're not always the best advocates for a cause or to bring people together. And as I say, there's many examples in our own history.
Looking within from outside can give a different perspective. Yeah. There's no doubt about it.
No, I think that's true. There is an advantage of coming here without preconceptions and being able to compare here to other places and how they run. But I think, on balance, I think being local is an advantage. If you had another one of me, and one was from Edinburgh and one was from Blackburn, I'd say, well, choose the one from Blackburn. But you don't have another one from me. But there just isn't another candidate who offers the same kind of experience and achievement.
And an MP election is not really about local. You have councillors for that. Yes, the MP will raise the profile of the town and bring issues, but
I think in terms of, I'd put it this way, and I think this is very important, in terms of who people vote for, and I'm just explaining this to some young people the other day, don't think of it as Britain's Got Talent. You're not voting for somebody who's going to win a prize. Think of it as a job interview, and you are the employer. You are interviewing who is the best candidate to actually do this job. And that's
that was my criticism of a lot of the selection processes. It should have been like a recruitment selection process. You're not choosing a religious leader or a caliph, which some people seem to think they are. You're choosing somebody who is best qualified to achieve certain objectives. And from my point of view, from Ayan's point of view, we had two main objectives. And one was Palestine, which is close to everybody's hearts, and the few extra pence you might get from Labour is not really going to be significant. And the other is breaking that control from the Labour Party and moving towards a more independent community and independent politics for the Muslim community. And whichever candidate can facilitate that, whether it's a Muslim or a non-Muslim, whether it's somebody from outside or from local, those would be the people that I would suggest we look at this election. Maybe at the next election it might be a different set of objectives, but I think the Palestine issue is going to be crucial for the next 5 years, as will maybe war overseas, and maybe the conflict will spread. So we need somebody strong enough to be able to challenge those. We don't need weak people or people whose politics is unknown. to be in Parliament.
Experience counts. Well, gentlemen, I'd like to say a very big thank you. And if you don't mind, Craig, I'm going to end this with a quote from you. You said that Gaza conflict between Israel and Hamas, a genocide is happening. Children are dying in the tens of thousands, and we must all work to stop it. And I think the emphasis is on all. Unless we all stand up and speak from the same hymn sheet, we will always be divided. And that's what we have been. And I think there are elements in our society which are splitting the vote. And the message is, let's stand together. Thank you, gentlemen, once again. And thank you for letting us in your rooms. Jazakallah khair. Look after yourself and your neighbors. Until next time, Allah Hafiz.
Thank you.